The rain fell upon London like a shroud of grey silk, relentless and cold, drumming against the windows of the Ashford townhouse with a rhythm that matched the anxious beating of Rosalind's heart. She stood in the drawing-room, her hands folded before her with a composure that belied the turmoil within, watching the rivulets trace their endless paths down the glass. The room around her felt smaller than it ever had. Despite its once grand proportions, the faded wallpaper, the worn patches on the carpet carefully concealed by strategically placed furniture, the paintings sold off one by one until only the least valuable remained. Autumn had settled over the city with a melancholy persistence, stripping the trees bare and turning the world to shades of brown and grey, as if nature itself mourned what was about to transpire. Behind her, she could hear her mother's nervous movements, the rustle of silk as she adjusted Rosalind's shawl for the third time, the barely suppressed tremor in her breathing. "You look very well, dearest," her mother said, her voice bright with a false cheer that made Rosalind's chest tighten. "The blue becomes you. It brings out your eyes." Rosalind nodded but did not turn from the window. She knew what she looked like: presentable, refined, the last valuable asset of a family teetering on the edge of ruin. Her father's investments, those grand schemes that had promised so much, had crumbled like sandcastles before the tide, leaving nothing but debt and shame in their wake. The tradesmen's bills piled on her father's desk like accusations. The servants had been let go one by one until only their most loyal remained, working for promises rather than wages. And now, this final solution, arranged with the cool efficiency of a business transaction. The Earl of Blackmoor required a wife. Her family required financial salvation. It was, her father had explained in his study 3 nights ago, a fortunate opportunity, fortuitous, a blessing, even. She had listened to his justifications, watched him avoid her eyes, and understood with perfect clarity that she was being sold, though no one would use such a vulgar word. Her mother touched her shoulder gently. "He will be here within the hour, a gentleman of great standing, Rosalind. You must remember that. We are fortunate he considered our proposal at all." Fortunate, that word again. Rosalind closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself one moment of private grief for the future she had once imagined. A marriage built on affection, on mutual regard, on the slow bloom of love she had read about in poems and novels. Then she opened them again, straightened her spine, and turned to face her mother with a calm she had learned to wear like armor. "I understand, Mamma," she said softly. "I shall do what is required." And she would, because there was no other choice, because her family's survival depended upon her acceptance, because this was the role Providence had assigned her. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean of nothing at all. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. Edmund Carre, Earl of Blackmoor, arrived precisely on the hour, and Rosalind understood immediately why her mother had seemed so nervous. He was not what she had expected, not elderly, not soft with indulgence, not kindly in the manner of gentlemen who sought companionship in their declining years. He was perhaps 35, tall and austere, with dark hair silvered prematurely at the temples, and eyes like winter itself, grey and impenetrable. His face might have been handsome had it not been set in such rigid lines, as though carved from the same cold stone as the monuments in Westminster Abbey. He wore black, unrelieved by any touch of colour, and moved with a controlled precision that suggested a man who had long ago decided that spontaneity was a luxury he could not afford. When he bowed to her mother and then to Rosalind herself, the gesture was correct in every particular and utterly devoid of warmth. Her father ushered them through the pleasantries with unseemly haste, his desperation barely concealed beneath a veneer of joviality, and then, with a cowardice that made Rosalind's throat tighten, withdrew with her mother to allow the Earl to speak with her privately. The silence that followed their departure was profound. Edmund, she could not think of him as Lord Blackmoor. It seemed too formal even for this Arctic encounter, studied her with an expression she could not read. Then he spoke, his voice low and carefully modulated. "I will not insult your intelligence with pretense, Lady Rosalind. You are aware of why I am here." She inclined her head. "I am, my lord. Your family requires financial assistance. I require a wife who understands the nature of the arrangement I am proposing." He paused, and something flickered in those cold eyes, though whether it was pain or merely impatience she could not say. "I am prepared to settle your father's debts in their entirety and provide your family with a generous annual allowance. In return, I ask for your name in marriage and, in time, an heir." The words were clinical, surgical in their precision. Rosalind felt each one like a small cut. "I see," she managed. "You must understand this clearly before you consent." He stepped closer, and she saw now that his eyes were not merely cold but carefully guarded, as though he had built walls behind them and would defend them at any cost. "I will give you my name but not my heart. I will provide for you handsomely, treat you with respect, and expect you to fulfill the duties of a countess. But I do not seek affection, nor will I offer it. This will be a marriage of practical convenience, nothing more. If you harbor romantic notions, I advise you to abandon them now." The words should have been cruel, yet he delivered them without cruelty, only a terrible, hollow finality. Rosalind felt something inside her wither, but she had known, had she not, that this was no love match. She had prepared herself for precisely this reality. Yet hearing it spoken so boldly, having the loneliness of her future laid out with such stark clarity, wounded her more deeply than she had anticipated. Still, she lifted her chin and met his gaze with steady composure. "I accept your terms, Lord Blackmoor. I will be your wife." For just a moment, surprise flickered across his features, as though he had expected tears or protests or maidenly distress. Instead, he found only quiet dignity, and something in his expression shifted, though the walls remained firmly in place. "Then we are agreed," he said softly, and it felt like a door closing on every dream she had ever harbored. The wedding took place on a grey morning in November, in a small chapel with more shadows than guests. Rosalind wore ivory silk that had belonged to her grandmother, altered hastily to fit her slender frame, and carried a small bouquet of hothouse roses that seemed too vibrant, too alive for the somber occasion. Edmund stood beside her at the altar in black, his face expressionless as he spoke his vows in a voice that carried no inflection, no hint of emotion. She repeated her own promises, hearing them as though from a great distance, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the kiss Edmund placed upon her cheek was as brief and cold as frost. Her mother wept, though whether from relief or sorrow Rosalind could not say. Her father looked merely tired, the weight of his failures temporarily lifted from his shoulders and placed upon hers. Within an hour of the ceremony's conclusion, she was seated in Edmund's carriage, watching London recede behind them as they travelled north toward his estate. He sat across from her, not beside her, and occupied himself with correspondence, his pen scratching against paper with mechanical regularity. She did not attempt conversation. The countryside rolled past, beautiful in its autumn desolation, and she committed it to memory as though she were leaving behind not just a city but an entire life. They arrived at Blackmoor Manor as twilight descended, and Rosalind's first glimpse of her new home stole what remained of her breath. The house rose from the landscape like something carved from the bones of the earth itself, grey stone, Gothic in its severe elegance, with tall windows that reflected the dying light like blind eyes. It was beautiful in the way that winter was beautiful, imposing and austere, surrounded by formal gardens that had been carefully tamed into geometric precision. There was no wildness here, no softness, only order maintained through iron discipline. Edmund handed her down from the carriage without a word and led her inside, where the housekeeper awaited them. Mrs. Dawes was a woman of middle years with kind eyes and a formal manner, who curtsied deeply and welcomed Rosalind with careful courtesy. "I've prepared the Countess's chambers, my lord," she said, and something in her tone suggested sympathy, though her face remained professionally neutral. The chambers were in the east wing, separated from Edmund's rooms by the length of a long corridor. They were beautiful, furnished with obvious expense, but they felt like a gilded cage. Mrs. Dawes showed her the dressing room, the sitting room, the bedchamber with its canopied bed, and then withdrew with a promise that dinner would be served at 8. Rosalind stood in the center of the room after the door closed, listening to the profound silence of the house, and felt the full weight of her isolation settle upon her shoulders like a physical thing. That evening, she dressed carefully and descended to the dining room, a cavernous space with a table that could seat 30. A single place had been set at one end. She waited, thinking perhaps Edmund had been delayed, But after 20 minutes a footman entered and informed her with obvious discomfort that his lordship took his meals in his study and would not be joining her. She ate alone, each bite tasteless, each moment stretching into eternity, and understood with perfect clarity that this was to be her life, beautiful, comfortable, cold, and utterly, achingly solitary. Weeks passed in a slow procession of identical days, each one bleeding into the next until Rosalind could scarcely distinguish Tuesday from Thursday, November from the encroaching December. She established a routine because routine was all she had: early morning walks through the frost-touched gardens, afternoons in the library where she discovered a remarkable collection of books that suggested depths to her husband she had not anticipated, and evenings spent with needlework or writing letters to her mother that she carefully edited to exclude any hint of her loneliness. The house was beautiful, she wrote, the countryside peaceful, the Earl respectful and generous, all true, and all utterly insufficient to convey the reality of her existence. Her encounters with Edmund were rare and excruciating in their awkwardness. Twice she met him in the corridor outside the breakfast room, and both times he nodded to her with rigid courtesy before finding some urgent business that required his immediate attention elsewhere. Once she entered the library to find him standing by the window, and he had startled like a wild creature discovered in its den, before murmuring something about estate ledgers and departing so swiftly he left a book open on the side table. She learned his patterns through careful observation, though he clearly worked to ensure their paths would not cross. He rose before dawn. She heard his footsteps in the corridor when the house was still dark and silent. He took breakfast alone in his study, worked through the morning with his steward, rode out to inspect his lands in the afternoon, and returned to his study until well past midnight. She knew this because she often woke in the small hours, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar bed, and from her window she could see the light burning in the west wing, where his private rooms were located, a single golden square in the darkness that seemed to her infinitely sad, though she could not say why. "His lordship works too hard, Mrs." Dawes remarked one morning as she supervised the changing of linens in Rosalind's sitting room. The housekeeper's tone was carefully neutral, but something in her expression invited confidence. "Has he always been so? Devoted to his duties?" "Oh?" Rosalind asked, the question escaping before she could consider the impropriety of discussing her husband with the staff. Mrs. Dawes was quiet for a moment, folding a pillowcase with precise corners. "No, my lady. There was a time when this house was quite different. But that was before—" She stopped abruptly, as though catching herself on the edge of an indiscretion. "Before?" Rosalind prompted gently. "Before grief changed him," the housekeeper said finally, and would say no more on the subject, though her eyes were kind with understanding. That afternoon, restless and increasingly suffocated by the walls of her beautiful prison, Rosalind walked in the garden despite the threatening sky. The rain began as a whisper and built to a steady downpour, but she remained under the shelter of an old oak, watching the water transform the landscape. Movement caught her eye: Edmund, standing alone in the center of the formal garden with no hat, no coat, letting the rain soak through his clothes as he stared at something she could not see. He looked like a man performing penance, or perhaps a man who had forgotten how to come in from the cold. She watched him for a long moment, this stranger who was her husband, and felt something stir within her that was not quite curiosity and not quite compassion, but something suspended between the two. The library had become her sanctuary, the one room in the vast house where she felt something approaching peace, surrounded by the companionable silence of thousands of volumes. She had worked her way through the novels Richardson and Austen and the Bronte sisters and had moved on to weightier fare, discovering a fascination with history and philosophy that surprised her. On a cold afternoon in early December, she was searching for a particular volume of Plutarch's Lives that she was certain she had seen on one of the upper shelves, standing on the rolling ladder with her skirts gathered carefully in one hand, when a voice from below startled her so badly she nearly lost her balance. The third shelf from the top, 4 volumes to the left. She looked down to find Edmund standing at the base of the ladder, one hand raised as though prepared to steady it should she fall. How long he had been there, watching her search, she could not say. "Thank you," she managed, reaching for the book he had indicated. Her fingers found it immediately. He had been precisely correct. When she descended, he had not moved, and they stood closer than they ever had since their wedding day, close enough that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "Plutarch," he said, his tone unreadable. An unexpected choice. She felt a flicker of defiance at what might have been condescension. "I find the parallel lives fascinating. The way he examines character through comparison, the moral questions he raises about leadership and virtue." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, she thought, quickly masked. "You read Greek philosophy by choice, not obligation." "I read whatever interests me, my lord. History, philosophy, natural science. I have a great deal of time to fill." The words came out more sharply than she intended, edged with the loneliness she tried so hard to conceal. For a moment, something almost like regret flickered across his features. "You have read Marcus Aurelius?" he asked, and there was a quality to the question that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "The Meditations, yes. I found his stoicism comforting, though perhaps too resigned to fate for my taste." "And you prefer Epictetus? The distinction between what we can control and what we cannot. There is power in that recognition, not merely resignation." He regarded her with an intensity that made her breath catch, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might say something more, something real. But then the familiar walls descended again, his expression closing like a door. "I hope you find the library adequate to your needs," he said formally, and was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing alone among the books with her heart beating strangely fast. But 2 days later, she found a volume outside her chamber door in the morning. A collection of Epictetus she had not known was in the library, bound in beautiful leather with gilt edges. There was no note, no explanation, but when she opened it, she found passages marked with barely visible pencil lines, as though someone had once sought comfort in these very pages. She ran her fingers over the marks, imagining him reading these same words, and something warm unfurled in her chest. The next week brought another book, and then another, a study of Roman history, a collection of essays by Montaigne, a volume of poetry by George Herbert. Each appeared silently at her door like offerings from an unseen benefactor, though she knew perfectly well who left them. He never acknowledged the gifts, never asked if she enjoyed them, but she understood that this was his language, the only way he knew to build a bridge across the distance he had created. And for the first time since arriving at Blackmoor Manor, Rosalind smiled. Winter settled over Blackmoor Manor with a hushed intensity, transforming the grounds into a landscape of white and grey, beautiful and desolate in equal measure. As Christmas approached, Rosalind found herself seized by a determination she had not felt since arriving at this cold, silent house. She would bring light into the darkness, warmth into the chill, even if only for herself. She enlisted Mrs. Dawes's help, and together they cut boughs of evergreen and holly from the estate, filling the entrance hall with the sharp, clean scent of pine. Rosalind wove the greenery into garlands and wreaths, her fingers growing sticky with sap, her cheeks flushed with something that felt almost like happiness. The housekeeper watched her with poorly concealed emotion, and when Rosalind asked about the family's Christmas traditions, the older woman's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "We used to decorate the entire house, my lady. There would be a great tree in the hall, and candles in every window, and such laughter." She trailed off, shaking her head. But that was long ago. Rosalind did not press for details, but she understood. This house had once known joy, and then had forgotten how to find it. Edmund's reaction to the decorations was immediate and unwelcome. She encountered him in the hallway on the morning of Christmas Eve, and his face darkened when he saw the garlands she had hung along the balustrade. "What is this?" His voice was tight, controlled, but she heard something beneath it that might have been pain. "It is Christmas, my lord. I thought to observe the season." "I do not observe it," he said flatly. "Please remove these." "No." The word escaped before she could reconsider, and she saw shock flicker across his features. "I will not remove them. You have made it clear that I am to be mistress of this household in name. Allow me at least this small authority." For a long moment they stood in tense silence, and then he turned on his heel and strode away without another word. But the decorations remained. That evening, she arranged for dinner to be served in the great hall rather than the lonely dining room, and sent word to Edmund's study that she hoped he would join her. His response came back with the footman. The Earl regretted that he was occupied with urgent correspondence. She should not have been disappointed. She had expected nothing else. yet her throat tightened with an emotion she refused to name. She dined alone at the beautifully set table, surrounded by candlelight and greenery that now seemed to mock her efforts, and when the meal concluded, she asked the footman to prepare a plate for his lordship. "Take it to his study," she instructed, "and tell him I wish him a peaceful Christmas." She retired to her chambers feeling hollow and tried to lose herself in one of the books he had left her, but the words swam before her eyes. Near midnight, unable to sleep, she ventured out into the corridor for some air and found the plate she had sent to Edmund's study sitting outside her door. It was empty, wiped clean, and beside it lay a small piece of paper with 2 words written in his precise, elegant hand: "Thank you." She picked up the note with trembling fingers, reading those 2 simple words again and again as though they were a revelation. It was not much, barely anything at all really, but it was more than he had given her before, more than silence and absence and careful avoidance. It was acknowledgement. It was, perhaps, the smallest crack in his carefully constructed walls. She pressed the paper to her chest and felt, for the first time in months, something that resembled hope. The new year arrived with a subtle shifting, as though some frozen thing within the house had begun, almost imperceptibly, to thaw. Rosalind noticed it first in small ways. Edmund no longer fled quite so quickly when they encountered each other in the corridors, and twice he had paused to inquire whether she had found the library's collection adequate. His questions were formal, his manner still guarded, but there was less ice in his voice, less rigidity in his posture. Then, one morning in mid-January, she entered the morning room for breakfast and found him already there, seated with his correspondence and a cup of coffee. She froze in the doorway, prepared to withdraw, but he looked up and gestured slightly toward the table. "Please," he said quietly, "do not let my presence disturb you." It was not precisely an invitation, but neither was it a dismissal, and so she took her seat at the opposite end of the table, her heart beating with an intensity that seemed absurd for so simple an act. They ate in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before, still awkward, still tentative, but not actively hostile. The next morning he was there again, and the morning after that, until it became an unspoken routine. Gradually, carefully, they began to exchange words beyond mere pleasantries. She learned that he rode out daily to inspect the tenant farms, that he had modernized several cottages at his own expense, and that he knew each family by name and concerned himself with their welfare in ways that surprised her. "You care deeply for those who depend on you," she observed one morning, and he looked up from his plate with something that might have been surprise. "It is my responsibility," he said simply. "They are not abstractions to me. They are people." She saw him differently after that, this man who maintained such careful distance from her, but gave generously to those he considered under his protection. It suggested a capacity for care that he kept tightly leashed, locked away behind walls she was only beginning to understand. One morning, after nearly a week of these shared breakfasts, he asked a question that was not about books or weather or estate matters. "Your family, how do they fare?" The inquiry was so unexpected that she nearly fumbled her teacup. "They are well, I believe. My mother writes regularly." "And your father?" There was something careful in his tone. She set down her cup, considering how much truth to offer. Then, perhaps because he had shown her more of himself in these quiet mornings than in all the months before, she chose honesty. "My father is relieved to have his debts cleared. Whether he has learned anything from his failures, I cannot say. I hope so, but I am not certain hope is sufficient." She paused, then added more softly, "I spent much of my life trying to be sufficient to make up for his inadequacies, to be the perfect daughter who might somehow balance his imperfections. It was an impossible task, of course." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and carried a weight of something she could not quite name. "You deserved better than this arrangement." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. She could have accepted them as an apology, could have retreated into wounded dignity, but instead she met his gaze steadily and offered her own truth. "Perhaps we both did, my lord, and yet here we are." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of shared circumstance. He nodded slowly, and though he said nothing more, when he rose to leave he paused beside her chair for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence before he walked away. But this time, she did not feel quite so alone. The village lay 1.5 miles from the manor, a collection of stone cottages clustered around a small church, and Rosalind had taken to walking there twice a week with a basket over her arm. She brought what she could: bread and cheese from the manor's kitchens, jars of preserves, a few coins from her small personal allowance. The widow Marsh had 3 children and a persistent cough that worried Rosalind, so she brought honey and herbs that Mrs. Dawes swore by. The Sutton family had a new baby and not enough blankets, so she quietly requisitioned several from the manor's linen closets. She did not do it for recognition or praise. She did it because these people were suffering, and she had the means, however limited, to ease that suffering. It gave her days purpose beyond the endless, echoing hours in the empty manor. She did not know that Edmund had seen her, that cold February afternoon, walking back from the village with her empty basket, her cheeks flushed from exertion and cold. He had been riding the northern boundary and had paused on the hill above the road, watching her progress with an expression that might have been curiosity. That evening, he found Mrs. Dawes in the housekeeper's room and asked, with studied casualness, whether her ladyship often walked to the village. Mrs. Dawes, who was nobody's fool, smiled gently. "Twice a week, my lord, regular as clockwork, takes food and medicine to the families most in need, uses her own allowance to purchase what she cannot requisition from our stores without drawing notice." He was silent for a long moment. "How long has she been doing this?" "Since January, my lord. Near on 6 weeks now." Something shifted in his chest, a sensation he could not quite name. That his wife, who had every right to be bitter about the coldness of their arrangement, who might have retreated into self-pity or resentment, had instead turned her attention outward to those who needed help. It unsettled something in him, cracked open a door he had thought permanently sealed. He found her in the drawing room after dinner, a room she rarely used, sitting near the fire with her needlework. She looked up in surprise when he entered, and he saw wariness flicker across her features before she composed herself. "My lord, I understand you have been visiting the tenants," he said without preamble. Color rose in her cheeks. "I hope I have not overstepped. I know I should have asked permission, but—" "You have not overstepped," he interrupted quietly. "I wish to increase the household funds at your disposal for such purposes, considerably." She stared at him, clearly stunned. That is very generous. It is merely practical. If there are families in need, they should be helped. You should not be funding charity from your personal allowance." He moved closer, drawn by something he did not fully understand. "Tell me about them, the families you visit." And so she did, haltingly at first, and then with growing confidence, describing the widow Marsh and her children, the Suttons with their new baby, old Thomas Grove, who had worked the land for 50 years and now could barely walk. Edmund listened, asked questions, and found himself genuinely interested not just in the information, but in the way her face came alive when she spoke of these people, the compassion that softened her features and lit her eyes. "Young Timothy Marsh wants to learn his letters," she said, and there was such hope in her voice. "His mother cannot teach him, but I thought perhaps—" "I will arrange for the vicar to tutor him," Edmund said, "and any other children who wish to learn." Her smile then was radiant, unguarded, and it struck him with unexpected force. "You are kinder than you pretend to be, my lord. I am merely doing what should be done," he said, but his voice was softer than he intended. And when she said something about how the Sutton baby had his father's stubborn chin, he felt the corner of his mouth lift in something that was almost, very nearly, a smile. The walls were cracking, and he was no longer entirely certain he wished to repair them. Spring came late to Blackmoor that year, but when it finally arrived, it did so with a sudden profusion of color that transformed the landscape almost overnight. The gardens that had seemed so austere in winter revealed themselves to be carefully planned masterpieces, with crocuses and daffodils giving way to tulips and early roses, each bed arranged with an artist's eye for color and form. Rosalind found herself drawn outside every afternoon, wandering the paths and discovering new blooms. And one day she looked up from admiring a bed of primroses to find Edmund standing a few yards away, watching her with an expression she could not read. "They are beautiful," she said, gesturing to the flowers. "I had not realized how extensive the gardens were. My mother designed them," he said, and then, as if the words had escaped without permission, he fell silent. But he did not leave, and after a moment he added quietly, She had very particular ideas about how things should be arranged. Every plant has its place, its purpose. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother, the first glimpse into the past that had shaped him. And Rosalind understood that she was being offered something fragile and precious. She had exquisite taste, she said gently. Would you show me? And so began a new routine, gentler than their breakfast conversations, more intimate in its silence. Most afternoons he would find her in the gardens, and they would walk together, his hands clasped behind his back, her fingers trailing over blossoms and leaves. He knew every plant by name, every tree's history, and gradually he began to share these details with her. This oak was 200 years old. That rose had been grafted from cuttings brought from France. The herb garden had medicinal plants his mother had used for the tenants. She died when I was 14, he said one afternoon, so quietly she almost missed it. They had stopped beside a weeping cherry in full bloom, its branches heavy with pale pink flowers. She planted this the year before. I watched it grow in her absence. Rosalind felt her throat tighten with sympathy. It must have been a comfort, she said carefully, to have something of her remain. Or a torment, he replied, but there was no bitterness in his voice, only a weary acceptance. Everything here reminds me of what was lost. She understood then, with sudden clarity, why he had built such walls around himself, why he had demanded a marriage without love. He was protecting himself from the devastation of loss, from the vulnerability of caring for something that could be taken away. I had a brother, she heard herself say. William, he died of scarlet fever when he was 7 and I was 10. For years afterward I would forget, momentarily, that he was gone. I would turn to tell him something, or save him a sweet, and then remember. She paused, remembering that small, piercing grief. The forgetting was almost worse than the remembering. Edmund turned to look at her fully, and in his eyes she saw recognition, the acknowledgement of shared pain. Yes, he said simply. Yes, exactly that. They stood together beneath the cherry tree, neither speaking, and then so naturally she almost did not notice his hand found hers. His fingers were warm, his grip gentle but firm, and for a long moment they stood connected in their mutual understanding of loss. Then he released her hand and continued walking, and she followed, neither of them acknowledging what had passed between them, but both feeling the fundamental shift that had occurred. The walls had not fallen, but they had developed cracks wide enough to let light through, and in that light, something new and tentative was beginning to grow. As summer arrived in earnest, bringing long golden evenings and the scent of roses heavy on the warm air, Rosalind realized with a mixture of wonder and dismay that somewhere along the way, without her permission or intent, the cold formality between them had transformed into something that resembled friendship. Edmund smiled now when she said something clever, and once, when she had made an observation about their stuffy neighbor's resemblance to a particularly pompous rooster, he had actually laughed a rusty sound, as though long unused, but genuine. They rode together in the mornings, their horses side by side through the countryside, and spent evenings in the library discussing the books they both loved, their conversations ranging from philosophy to poetry to the nature of consciousness itself. They took all their meals together now, and she had learned his preferences. He took his coffee black, disliked lamb, had a weakness for lemon tarts he thought no one had noticed. She knew the way his brow furrowed when he was working through a difficult problem, the precise angle of his head when he was truly listening, the rare softness that entered his eyes when he spoke of the estate and its people. She knew him, and in knowing him, she had made a terrible mistake. She had fallen in love with him. The realization came to her one afternoon in the rose garden, watching him explain the proper way to prune a climbing rose to one of the gardeners, his hands gentle on the stems, his voice patient. Her heart had simply turned over in her chest, and she had understood with devastating clarity that what she felt for this complicated, wounded, careful man went far beyond respect or friendship or gratitude. She loved him, his intelligence, his hidden kindness, the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. She loved the man beneath the walls, and the knowledge terrified her because she had agreed to a marriage without love, had accepted those terms, and she had no right to change them now unilaterally. So she tried to hide it, to maintain the careful boundaries he had established, to be grateful for his friendship without asking for more. But it became increasingly difficult as she caught moments, fleeting, devastating moments, when she thought she saw something in his eyes that matched what she felt in her heart. One evening in late June, they stood together on the terrace after dinner, watching the sun set in brilliant streaks of orange and gold. The air was soft and warm, perfumed with honeysuckle, and she was achingly conscious of his nearness, of the breadth of his shoulders, the strong line of his jaw. She turned to say something inconsequential about the beauty of the evening, and found him looking at her with an intensity that stopped her breath. His eyes were dark and unguarded, and in them she saw longing, desire, and something that looked heartbreakingly like fear. For a suspended moment, neither of them moved, the air between them charged with possibility, and she hoped that he might close the distance between them, might acknowledge what was growing in the space they had created. But then something shuttered in his expression, and he stepped back as though burned. "I should attend to correspondence," he said, his voice tight, controlled. "Forgive me." "Good evening, Lady Rosalind." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone on the terrace with the dying light and a pain in her chest that felt remarkably like her heart breaking. She had thought the worst loneliness was the isolation of those first months, but she understood now that there was a deeper loneliness still to love someone and stand so close to them, yet remain forever unable to breach the final distance between. Edmund stood at the window of his study, watching Rosalind walk through the garden below, and acknowledged what he had been denying for weeks. He was breaking every rule he had set for himself, and he had no idea how to stop. She moved with unconscious grace among the roses, pausing occasionally to touch a bloom or tilt her face toward the sun, and something in his chest tightened painfully at the sight. He had promised her his name but not his heart, had been explicit in his terms, had built walls specifically to prevent this exact situation. Yet somehow, despite all his careful defenses, she had slipped through. He turned from the window, forcing himself to face the truth he had been avoiding. It had been 5 years since Catherine died, 5 years since he had held his wife's hand, while the life drained out of her, while the physicians shook their heads and murmured about childbirth, fever, and the will of God. 5 years since he had buried her, and the son who had never drawn breath, and stood in the rain beside their graves, feeling something inside him die as well. He had loved Catherine with the uncomplicated devotion of youth, and losing her had nearly destroyed him. For months afterward he had been a ghost in his own house, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to feel anything but the crushing weight of grief and guilt. If he had not insisted on an heir, if he had been content with what they had, she would still be alive. It was his ambition, his need for a son to carry on the family name, that had killed her as surely as the fever. When he finally emerged from that dark period, he had made himself a vow. Never again would he open himself to such devastation. He would marry again because he needed an heir, duty demanded it, but he would keep his heart carefully locked away where it could not be destroyed. He had thought it would be simple. He had thought he could live beside a woman, treat her with respect and courtesy, and never feel more than mild affection. He had been catastrophically wrong. Rosalind had undone him with her quiet strength, her intelligence, her unexpected kindness to his tenants. She read philosophy and argued with him about stoicism, and made him laugh when he had forgotten laughter was possible. She had transformed his cold house into something approaching a home, and worse, far worse, she had made him want things he had renounced. He wanted to tell her about Catherine, about his son, about the grief that still woke him in the night. He wanted to hear her thoughts not just about books but about life, about the future, about what she dreamed of when she thought no one was watching. He wanted to touch her not just in passing but with purpose, to learn the texture of her skin, the weight of her in his arms. He wanted, God help him, to love her completely, and the terror of that wanting was almost enough to send him to his knees. Because if he loved her, if he allowed himself to love her, then he would have something to lose again, and he did not think he could survive another loss. The solution, such as it was to maintain distance, to retreat behind formality before he revealed too much, before she guessed what she had come to mean to him. It was cowardice disguised as protection, and he knew it, but he could not seem to help himself. So he watched her from windows, listened for her voice in the corridors, treasured every moment in her presence, while simultaneously finding excuses to cut those moments short. "I am a fool," he said aloud to the empty room, and the words felt like both confession and condemnation. By late summer, the tension between them had grown to something nearly unbearable, a constant hum of unspoken words and suppressed longing that colored every interaction. Rosalind had grown quieter, more withdrawn, the light that had animated her in the spring gradually dimming as she retreated behind her own walls. She no longer sought him out in the library, no longer asked him to walk with her in the gardens. She was unfailingly polite when they encountered each other, but there was a new distance in her eyes, a careful guardedness that cut him more deeply than any accusation could have. She was protecting herself, he realized, and the knowledge that he had driven her to this filled him with a self-loathing that made the meals they still shared together nearly intolerable. He wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, to tell her everything, but fear kept him frozen in place, unable to bridge the gap that was growing wider each day. The household staff noticed, of course. Mrs. Dawes in particular watched them both with an expression that mingled sympathy and frustration, and one afternoon she cornered Edmund in the hallway outside his study with the determination of a woman who had known him since childhood and felt no compunction about speaking her mind. "My lord, forgive my presumption, but I cannot stand by and watch this continue." He stiffened. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Dawes." "Don't you?" She fixed him with a look that reminded him forcibly of his old governess. "That girl is wilting like a flower without water, and you're walking around like a man on his way to the gallows. Don't let pride take another person you love, my lord. You've already paid that price once." "I don't love," he began, but the words died on his lips because they were a lie, and they both knew it. Mrs. Dawes simply shook her head and walked away, leaving him standing in the corridor with the truth he could no longer deny echoing in his mind. The storm came that evening, rolling in from the north with dramatic suddenness, turning the sky black and sending servants scurrying to close windows and shutters. Edmund was in his study when he heard the commotion, the raised voices calling for Lady Rosalind, the worry threading through the household. He found a maid in the hallway, her face pinched with concern. "My lady went out walking an hour ago, my lord, before the storm. She hasn't returned." Fear, cold and immediate, gripped him. He was moving before he made the conscious decision to do so, striding through the house and out into the rain, shouting her name. He found her coming up the drive, soaked to the skin, her dress clinging to her frame, her hair plastered to her face. She was shivering violently, and when she saw him she stopped, something defiant flashing in her eyes. "What in God's name were you thinking?" The words came out harsher than he intended, sharpened by fear. "I was walking," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking. "I needed air. In the middle of a storm. You could have been struck by lightning, injured. What does it matter to you?" The question was quiet, but it cut like a blade. "You made it perfectly clear what the boundaries of our arrangement are. I am well within my rights to walk where and when I please. You're being reckless and foolish, and you're being a hypocrite." Her voice rose, all the careful control she had maintained for months finally breaking. "You draw me close and then push me away. You look at me as though—" She stopped abruptly, but the words hung between them, charged with all the emotion they had been suppressing. He stood in the rain, looking at her stricken face, and felt something crack open inside him. "As though what?" he demanded, moving closer. "Tell me." But she only shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself, and turned toward the house. The argument was not finished, but she was walking away, and he watched her go with his heart in his throat and rain streaming down his face. He caught up with her in the entrance hall, water pooling on the marble floor beneath them both, and grasped her arm gently but firmly. "Rosalind, please, tell me what's wrong." She spun to face him, and he saw that there were tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks, her composure finally completely shattered. "What does it matter to you?" she said again, her voice breaking. "You made it clear from the beginning you gave me your name but not your heart. Those were your exact words, my lord. A marriage of practical convenience, nothing more. I accepted those terms. I agreed to them. But you—" her breath hitched. "You let me hope. You left me books and walked with me in the gardens and made me believe that perhaps we might be more than two strangers occupying the same house. And then every time I thought we had found something real, you pulled away, and I—" She pressed her hand to her mouth as though to stop the words, but they kept coming, a dam broken after months of careful restraint. "I have been so lonely. I tried not to care, tried to accept what I could have and not ask for more, but I cannot help what I feel. I cannot help that I fell in love with you despite every attempt not to, and I cannot bear being so close to you while remaining forever at a distance. It is a torment I did not anticipate, and I walked in the storm because at least the rain was something I could feel, something real, instead of this endless aching. She stopped abruptly, seeming to realize what she had confessed, and horror filled her eyes. "Forgive me, I should not have said," but Edmund was staring at her as though she had struck him, her words reverberating through him with seismic force. She loved him. She had said it plainly, without artifice, and the naked pain in her voice was unbearable. He had done this to her, had caused this suffering through his cowardice and fear, and standing there watching her shatter before him, he finally understood that his attempts to protect them both had only created a different kind of devastation. "Rosalind," he began, but she was shaking so violently now that the words died in his throat. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and when she swayed slightly, he realized with alarm that she was not merely cold, but dangerously chilled. Everything else, the argument, the confessions, the emotional chaos, became suddenly, starkly secondary to the immediate fact of her physical distress. "You're freezing," he said, and without waiting for permission, he swept her into his arms. She made a weak sound of protest but lacked the strength to resist as he carried her up the stairs, shouting for Mrs. Dawes, for hot water, for blankets and towels. In her chambers he set her in a chair by the fire, while the housekeeper and a maid rushed to bring what was needed, and he stayed, ignoring propriety, ignoring everything except the fear that had taken root in his chest. "My lord, you should—" Mrs. Dawes began gently, gesturing toward the door. "I'm staying," he said flatly, and something in his tone brooked no argument. He turned his back while the maid helped Rosalind out of her sodden dress and into a nightgown, but he did not leave, and when they had her settled in bed, wrapped in blankets with hot bricks at her feet, he pulled a chair close and took her hand. She was already feverish. He could feel the heat of her skin, and her eyes were too bright, unfocused. "You should go," she whispered. "You don't want—" "I won't leave you," he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "Do you hear me, Rosalind? I won't leave you. Not now, not ever again." It was the first true promise he had made her since their wedding day, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The fever took hold with terrifying swiftness, transforming what might have been a simple chill into something far more dangerous. By morning, Rosalind was burning with heat, tossing restlessly in the bed and crying out in distress, and the doctor who arrived from the village took one look at her and pronounced it brain fever, his expression grave. "She's very ill, my lord. The next few days will be critical. She must be kept cool, given water whenever she'll take it, and watched constantly. I cannot promise," he trailed off, but Edmund heard what he did not say, the words that hung unspoken in the air like a death knell. She might not survive. Edmund sent the doctor away with instructions to return twice daily and established himself at Rosalind's bedside with an immovability that alarmed the household. He would not leave, would not rest, would barely eat the food that Mrs. Dawes brought and left on a tray that often went untouched. Day blurred into night and back into day again, time losing all meaning in that dim chamber where he kept vigil. He tended her himself with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew only the cold Earl of Blackmoor, bathing her burning skin with cool cloths, coaxing water between her cracked lips drop by precious drop, holding her when she thrashed and murmuring words he barely registered in his exhaustion. The staff helped Mrs. Dawes, bringing fresh water and clean linens, a maid spelling him for brief moments when he could be persuaded to step away, but he was there for every moment that mattered, unwilling to trust anyone else with her care. She was delirious more often than lucid, lost in fever dreams that carried her far from him. She called for her mother in a voice that broke his heart, cried for William, her lost brother, pleaded with people he could not see, and begged forgiveness for transgressions he knew she had never committed. Sometimes she wept, tears sliding down her flushed cheeks, while she apologized again and again for being a burden, for failing, for not being enough. "You are enough," he told her fiercely, gripping her hand. "You have always been enough, more than enough. You are everything." But she could not hear him, or if she could, the words made no sense through the fog of her illness. Other times she whispered his name, Edmund, with such longing that it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. She reached for him with trembling hands, and he caught them, held them, pressed them to his lips while tears he could not stop ran down his face. On the third day the doctor returned, examined her carefully, and drew Edmund aside with an expression that filled him with cold dread. "My lord, I must be honest with you. The fever is not breaking. If it continues much longer—" He did not finish the sentence, but Edmund understood. She was dying. He was losing her, just as he had lost Catherine. And this time it was worse, because this time he had wasted the time they had been given, had squandered precious months in fear and cowardice. He had told himself he was protecting them both, but he had only been protecting himself. And now she would die, never knowing that she had become the center of his world, and that he loved her with an intensity that terrified him, that the thought of existing in a world without her was unbearable. He returned to her bedside, took her burning hand in his, and allowed himself to acknowledge the full truth of what he had been denying. He loved her. He had loved her for months, perhaps from the moment she had accepted his cold proposal with quiet dignity, certainly from the day she had smiled at him over Plutarch. And now he was losing her, and the injustice of it, that he should finally understand what he felt, only to have her torn away, was almost more than he could bear. The crisis came on the fourth night, when the fever spiked so high that Rosalind's skin burned like fire beneath his hands, and she thrashed with such violence that he feared she would injure herself. Edmund was beyond exhaustion, unshaven and hollow-eyed, his clothes rumpled from days without changing, but he held her with steady hands and murmured to her constantly, trying to anchor her to consciousness and to life, to him. Mrs. Dawes hovered nearby with fresh water and cloths, her face etched with worry, and the doctor had been sent for again, though what more he could do Edmund did not know. He bathed her burning skin with water that seemed to evaporate on contact, and when that brought no relief, he found himself doing something he had not done in years. He prayed. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, his words addressed to a God he had stopped believing in when Catherine died. "Please don't take her. Take anything else, my lands, my title, my life, if you require it, but don't take her. I cannot lose her. I cannot." The words became a litany, repeated until they lost meaning, and somewhere in the depths of his exhausted desperation, he began to speak not to God, but to Rosalind herself, pouring out everything he had kept locked away for so long. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I have loved you for months, perhaps from the very beginning, though I was too much a coward to acknowledge it. You came into my cold house and brought light with you, warmth I thought I would never feel again. You made me laugh, made me hope, made me want things I had renounced. And I repaid your kindness with distance and coldness, because I was afraid. God, I was so afraid of losing you that I never let myself truly have you." Tears ran unchecked down his face, dripping onto their joined hands. "I told you I would give you my name but not my heart, but you took it anyway. You took it without trying, simply by being yourself, brave and kind and stronger than I ever was. And I was such a fool, wasting the time we had, keeping you at arm's length when all I wanted was to hold you close. If you stay," his voice broke completely, "if you stay with me, I swear I will spend every day making up for the months I wasted. I will tell you every morning that I love you. I will never let you doubt what you mean to me. But you have to stay, Rosalind. You have to fight. Please don't leave me alone in the darkness again." He laid his head on the bed beside her, still holding her hand, weeping with an abandon he had not permitted himself since he was a child. He wept for her, for them, for all the time he had squandered, and the future they might never have. He wept until he had no tears left, and then he simply held her hand and waited, because there was nothing else he could do. Near dawn, when the sky was just beginning to lighten beyond the windows, he felt the change. The terrible heat beneath his hand began to recede, slowly at first and then more noticeably. Her restless thrashing stilled, and her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid for days, deepened and steadied. He lifted his head, afraid to hope, and touched her forehead with trembling fingers. The fever had broken. She was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, truly sleeping rather than lost in delirium, and the color in her cheeks, while still pale, was no longer the alarming flush of fever. Relief crashed over him with such force that for a moment he could not breathe. She would live. She would survive this, and he would have the chance to tell her everything, to make right what he had broken, to love her the way she deserved to be loved. He collapsed back in the chair, still holding her hand as though it were a lifeline, and let exhaustion finally claim him. Rosalind woke to silence and soft morning light, and for a moment she could not remember where she was, or why her body felt so heavy, so weak, as though she had been wrung out and left to dry. Her throat was parched, her head ached with a dull persistence, but her mind was blessedly clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She turned her head slowly and found Edmund asleep in a chair pulled close to her bedside, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, his hand still holding hers where it lay on the coverlet. The sight of him struck her with unexpected force. He looked haggard, worn to the bone, with dark circles beneath his eyes and several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw. His clothes were rumpled, his cravat missing entirely, and there was something profoundly vulnerable about him in sleep that made her chest tighten. He had stayed with her. Even in her fever-clouded memories, she recalled his presence, his voice, the cool touch of his hands. The door opened quietly, and Mrs. Dawes entered carrying fresh water. When she saw Rosalind awake and aware, her face transformed with joy so profound it brought tears to the housekeeper's eyes. "My lady," she breathed, hurrying to the bedside. "Oh, thank God, we've been so worried." "How long?" Rosalind's voice was barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. "4 days, my lady. You've been desperately ill. Brain fever," the doctor said. "We feared." She stopped, pressing her lips together. "But you've come through it." The fever broke just before dawn. Rosalind looked again at Edmund's sleeping form. "He stayed." Something softened in Mrs. Dawes's expression. "He never left your side, my lady. Not once. We tried to make him rest, to eat, but he wouldn't hear of it. Just stayed right there, tending you himself, talking to you even when you couldn't hear. I've never seen." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Rosalind felt something unfurl in her chest, cautious and fragile but unmistakably like hope. She had confessed her love to him in the storm, had laid bare her heart in a way that terrified her, and she had been too ill to see his response and to know whether her words had driven him further away or drawn him closer. But he had stayed. Through 4 days and nights of her illness, he had stayed. As if sensing her gaze, Edmund stirred, his eyes opening slowly. For a moment he seemed disoriented, and then his gaze focused on her face, and he went completely still. The relief that flooded his features was so naked, so unguarded, that it took her breath away. "Rosalind," he said, her name barely more than an exhalation. "You stayed," she whispered. He straightened in the chair, leaning closer, and she saw that his eyes were red-rimmed, that his hand trembled slightly where it held hers. "I couldn't leave you," he said, and his voice was raw with emotion, stripped of all the careful control she had grown accustomed to. "I cannot ever leave you. Not now. Not ever." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning she was almost afraid to interpret. She searched his face, looking for the walls, the careful distance, and found instead only an openness that made her heart race despite her weakness. "Edmund," she began, but he shook his head. "Let me say this while I have the courage," he interrupted quietly. "I have been a coward and a fool, and I nearly lost you because of it. But if you will permit me, when you are well, I have a great deal I need to tell you." She reached up with her free hand, the movement exhausting but necessary, and touched his face. He turned into her palm, his eyes closing briefly, and then he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it with a reverence that told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had passed during her illness, whatever had changed, the walls between them had finally fallen. Her recovery was slow but steady, and through it all Edmund remained constantly at her side with an attentiveness that would have seemed impossible mere weeks ago. He read to her for hours poetry and history and novels, his voice a soothing presence that anchored her to the world. He brought her meals on trays and coaxed her to eat when she had no appetite, patient and gentle in ways she had never imagined him capable of being. He sat with her in comfortable silence when she was too tired for conversation, simply holding her hand, and the walls that had defined their relationship for so long had disappeared so completely it was as though they had never existed. A week after the fever broke, when she was strong enough to sit up against pillows and her mind had regained its usual clarity, Edmund came to her room in the afternoon and asked if she felt well enough to talk. Something in his expression, serious but no longer guarded, made her heart quicken, and she nodded, gesturing to the chair beside her bed. He sat, silent for a long moment as though gathering his thoughts, and then he began to speak. He told her about Catherine, his first wife, and the way she had died, bringing their son into the world. His voice was steady, but she could hear the old grief beneath it, the wound that had never fully healed. He described the months afterward, the darkness that had consumed him, the way he had closed himself off from feeling anything, because feeling meant pain. "I built walls," he said quietly, "because I could not survive another loss. And when I decided to marry again, I convinced myself that I could keep those walls intact, that I could have a wife for practical purposes, without ever risking my heart. I thought if I never loved, I could never lose." He looked at her then, and his eyes were dark with emotion. "But you," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, "you undid all my carefully laid plans. You slipped through every defense I built without even trying. You were kind when you had every right to be bitter. You were strong when I gave you nothing to be strong for. You made me laugh and made me hope and made me want to live instead of merely exist. And I was terrified, Rosalind. Terrified of what you had come to mean to me. Terrified of losing you the way I lost Catherine. So I pulled away, kept you at distance, and nearly destroyed us both in the process." Tears slipped down Rosalind's cheeks, moved beyond words by his vulnerability, by the trust he was placing in her with this confession. "I thought I wasn't enough," she whispered, "that you looked at me and found me wanting. I have spent my whole life feeling like a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved, and when you married me I thought that was all I would ever be to you, a duty fulfilled." He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "You were never a burden," he said fiercely. "Never. You are the greatest gift I never thought to ask for, the answer to prayers I was too afraid to speak. You brought light back into my darkness, Rosalind. You made me remember what it means to be fully alive." She smiled through her tears, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I love you," she said simply. "I told you that in the storm, and I meant it. I love you, Edmund, with all that I am." "I know," he said softly. "I heard you, and I have been waiting for you to be well enough so I could say it back. I love you, Rosalind. I have loved you for so long, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you'll let me." She drew him closer, and he came willingly, carefully mindful of her weakness, and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. "No more walls," she whispered against his shoulder. "No more walls," he promised. "Never again." 2 days later, when Rosalind was well enough to sit in the chair by the window with afternoon sunlight warming her face, Edmund came to her with an expression that was equal parts determination and nervousness. He knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his, and the gesture was so unexpected, so humble, that her breath caught. "I need to say this properly," he began, his voice low and intense. "When I married you, I made you a promise I would give you my name, but not my heart. It was a cruel promise, born of fear and cowardice, and I have regretted those words every day since I spoke them. The truth is, Rosalind, that I gave you my heart whether I acknowledged it or not. It has been yours for months, perhaps from the very beginning when you stood in your father's drawing room and accepted my cold proposal with such dignity. Certainly it was yours from the day you smiled at me over those books in the library, when I realized that you were not what I expected, but something infinitely more precious." He paused, and his grip on her hands tightening. "I love you. I am desperately, completely in love with you, and I am asking, begging, if you can forgive me for the coldness I showed you, for the months I wasted, for being too much a coward to tell you what you meant to me until I nearly lost you." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of relief so profound it felt like absolution. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I loved you even when I tried not to, even when I thought it was hopeless. I loved you in the silences and the small kindnesses you tried to hide. I loved you when you walked with me in the gardens and when you left books outside my door. I have been yours for so long, Edmund, waiting for you to let me in." He reached up to cup her face, wiping away her tears with his thumbs, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "I know I promised only my name, but if you'll have it, my heart has been yours since the day you smiled over those books. Since the moment you argued with me about Epictetus. Since I watched you care for my tenants and transform my cold house into a home. It has always been yours, even when I was too afraid to admit it." And then he kissed her, properly kissed her for the first time, and it was nothing like the brief, cold brush of lips at their wedding. This kiss was tender and tentative, full of promise and healing, an apology and a declaration and a beginning all at once. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Can we begin again?" he asked softly. Start fresh with honesty between us? She smiled, her hand coming up to cradle his face. I don't think we're beginning again, she said. I think we're continuing forward, but this time together, in truth rather than in careful distance. He nodded, understanding blooming in his eyes. Together in truth, he repeated, and pulled her close, careful of her lingering weakness but unable to maintain any distance between them. No more walls, Rosalind. I promise you no more walls. No more walls, she echoed, and in that moment, wrapped in his arms with sunlight streaming through the window, she felt truly, completely home for the first time in her life. They had both built defenses against pain. Both tried to protect themselves from loss, but in tearing down those walls they had found something infinitely more valuable. They had found each other, wholly and completely, and that was worth any risk, any vulnerability, any fear. Years later, when autumn came again to Blackmoor Manor, it arrived not with melancholy but with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the life that now filled every corner of the estate. Rosalind stood in the garden that had once seemed so austere, watching the afternoon sun paint the roses in shades of gold, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. She was no longer the pale, lonely woman who had walked these paths in silent isolation, but someone radiant with health and happiness, her face alight with contentment as she watched the scene before her. The garden rang with children's laughter. Their son Thomas, aged 5 and all boundless energy, chased his sister Catherine, 3 years old and determined to keep pace with her brother despite her shorter legs. They wove between the flower beds with the abandon of children who knew themselves completely loved, their voices high and joyful, and Rosalind's heart swelled with a gratitude so profound it sometimes overwhelmed her. Edmund emerged from the house carrying their youngest daughter, Anne, barely a year old, and drowsing against his shoulder with the boneless contentment of a well-loved child. He crossed the lawn to where Rosalind stood, and without breaking stride, leaned down to kiss her, a casual gesture of affection that spoke of long intimacy, of a love that had only deepened with time. She smiled against his lips and then rested her head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby, and together they watched their older children play. They're getting mud all over Catherine's dress, Edmund observed mildly, but there was no censure in his voice, only fond amusement. Mrs. Dawes will scold, Rosalind agreed, equally unconcerned. But they're happy, and that matters more than clean clothes. He shifted the baby in his arms and slipped his free hand around Rosalind's waist, drawing her close against his side. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then he said quietly, I almost lost you twice, you know. Once to my fear and foolishness, and once to that fever. Sometimes I wake in the night and remember, and the terror is as fresh as it was then. She turned to look up at him, seeing the shadow that still occasionally crossed his features when he thought of how close they had come to missing all of this. But you didn't lose me, she reminded him gently, reaching up to touch his face. We found our way to each other, Edmund. Through all the walls and fear and misunderstanding, we found each other. And look what we've built. She gestured to their children, to the house that rose behind them, no longer cold and imposing, but warm and welcoming, with ivy softening its stone walls and flowers blooming in every window box. It was a home in truth now, filled with love and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family life. I never imagined this, he said softly. When I married you, I never imagined I could be this happy, this blessed. You gave me everything, Rosalind, hope and joy and a future I thought I'd lost forever. We gave it to each other, she corrected, and kissed him again as Anne stirred and made a small sound of protest at being caught between them. Thomas came running up then, declaring himself starving, and Catherine was not far behind, and as the sun began to set, they all walked together toward the house, Edmund with the baby, Rosalind holding Catherine's hand, Thomas running ahead to announce that he wanted jam with his bread. The manor welcomed them home, its windows glowing with warm light, and in that moment everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it was always meant to be, once they had found the courage to tear down their walls and let love in. Dear listener, we build such careful walls around our hearts, do we not? Stone by stone, we construct our defenses, telling ourselves that if we never risk, we can never lose, that if we never open ourselves to love, we can never know the devastation of its absence. Edmund built his walls from grief, Rosalind from a lifetime of feeling insufficient, and for months They lived side by side in a beautiful house that was not a home, close enough to touch, but separated by barriers of their own making. We tell ourselves that such walls are protection, that they are wisdom born of painful experience, that they are necessary for survival, and perhaps in their way, they are for a time. But walls that protect us can also imprison us, keeping out not just pain but joy, not just loss but love, not just heartbreak, but the very connections that make life worth living. The truth that Edmund and Rosalind discovered, the truth that perhaps we all must learn, is that sometimes the right person slips through our defenses, not despite our walls, but because they see beyond them, to the wounded, frightened, hopeful soul beneath. Love, real love, requires extraordinary courage. It asks us to be vulnerable when every instinct screams for self-protection. It demands that we risk everything: our pride, our safety, our carefully constructed emotional fortifications for something we cannot control and cannot guarantee. It is terrifying, this opening of ourselves to another person, this admission that we need and want and love when we have built our entire existence around not needing, not wanting, not loving. Yet what is the alternative? To live as Edmund and Rosalind lived in those early months, occupying the same space but never truly connecting, surrounded by comfort and security but hollow at the center. To be so afraid of loss that we never truly have anything worth losing. Sometimes the arrangements we resist, the paths we did not choose for ourselves, become our greatest blessings. Sometimes the gifts we need most are the ones we never thought to ask for. Rosalind did not choose to marry Edmund out of love, and he did not choose her for affection. Yet in the crucible of their practical arrangement, they found something profound and true. So to you, dear listener, wherever you are in your own journey, I offer this gentle encouragement. Remain open, even after heartbreak. Recognize love when it appears in unexpected forms, in books left outside doors, in shared silences, in the slow tearing down of walls. Be patient with those who struggle to express what they feel, who pull away when they most want to draw close, who protect themselves with coldness because they are terrified of their own capacity to care. May you find connections that heal rather than harm, love that builds rather than diminishes, someone who sees beyond your walls to the truth of who you are. May you have the courage to be vulnerable, to risk your heart, to tear down your own carefully constructed defenses. And may you rest well tonight in the knowledge that love can surprise us, can find us even when we have convinced ourselves we do not seek it, can transform arrangements of convenience into unions of profound joy. After all, the strongest homes are not built on walls that keep others out, but on hearts brave enough to let the right person in. This has been a story from Unexpected Love Chronicles. If these tales of hope and healing bring you comfort, please subscribe and join us again. Until then, may your own walls crumble in the presence of love, and may you find the courage to build not barriers, but bridges to the hearts that are meant to meet yours.